Maplewood Estates looked like the kind of neighborhood that belonged on a real estate brochure. White fences, manicured lawns, symmetrical mailboxes, and the faint hum of sprinklers misting in the early morning sun. From the outside, it was paradise for anyone chasing suburban perfection. But beneath that neat, green surface, an invisible tension simmered, growing thicker with every passing month. At the center of it all was Margaret Halliday, the HOA president. To new residents, she seemed like the model of civility, always smiling, always organizing potlucks, always insisting that community standards keep our property values high. But those who had lived there long enough knew the truth. Margaret wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was controlling it. Her reign began innocently enough. Small notices about overgrown hedges, reminders to bring trash cans in by dusk. But slowly her tone hardened. She began fining people for leaving Christmas lights up one day too long, or for painting their doors in unauthorized shades. When one homeowner put up a small welcome sign shaped like a sunflower, Margaret personally showed up, clipboard in hand, to declare it non-compliant. To her, rules were sacred, unless they applied to her. Margaret's house, though grand and spotless on the outside, was an exception to nearly every HOA regulation she enforced. Her garden statues, her 2 extra driveway lights, even the oversized mailbox, all technically violations, but no one dared to mention it. Not unless they wanted to be the next target. And then came Daniel Reyes. He wasn't new to Maplewood Estates, but he was quiet, the kind of homeowner who paid his dues, mowed his lawn, and kept to himself. He'd moved in after his divorce, seeking peace and stability. But he quickly realized that peace was something the HOA didn't allow unless you played by Margaret's rules. It started when Margaret fined him for leaving his trash cans out too early. He put them out at 7 p.m., the night before pickup, just like everyone else. But Margaret had taken a photo, time-stamped, and sent it to the HOA group email. A formal warning, she wrote. Second violation would mean a fine. Then came another, a letter accusing him of having unauthorized paintwork on his front door. He had repainted it navy blue, a color within HOA-approved guidelines. But Margaret claimed it was too dark and disrupted the neighborhood aesthetic. The other residents whispered about it. Some sympathized with Daniel, but no one wanted to get involved. Margaret had a reputation for finding ways to make trouble for anyone who crossed her. Still, Daniel didn't fight back at first. He figured it wasn't worth the trouble. But the final straw came 3 months later, when Margaret accused him of unauthorized landscaping. She claimed his small row of rose bushes, planted along his front walkway, violated HOA regulations because they were too close to the property line. When Daniel politely asked for proof, she refused. A week later, he received a formal notice, $250 fine, and mandatory removal of the plants. That night, he sat on his porch, staring at the roses he'd planted in memory of his late mother, the one thing that brought a bit of warmth to the otherwise cold neighborhood. He watched Margaret's porch across the street. Her lights glowed softly, illuminating her array of garden decorations, the same kind she fined others for having. That's when the first spark of defiance lit inside him. Over the next few weeks, Daniel started paying closer attention. He noticed how Margaret's front yard had a brand new stone pathway installed, something that required HOA approval, which she never requested. He saw her car parked halfway across the sidewalk, another HOA violation. He noticed her pool lights flickering after midnight, despite a neighborhood rule against late-night lighting. The deeper he looked, the more contradictions he found. And then one evening, while walking his dog past her house, Daniel noticed something strange. Through the half-open blinds, he saw Margaret at her kitchen table surrounded by folders, envelopes, and a laptop. She was typing fast, occasionally glancing at a stack of paper marked with the HOA logo. What caught his attention was a small pile of checks, not printed checks from the HOA account, but personal ones. She was writing them out, signing them quickly, and tucking them into a manila envelope. He didn't think much of it until a few days later when he got an accidental HOA email, a notice meant for the treasurer, but mistakenly sent to all residents. It contained a partial budget summary for the month. Under landscaping and maintenance, there was an unexplained withdrawal of $2,400. The description read, "Community Improvement Project, approved by board." But there had been no such project. Daniel's curiosity turned to suspicion, and his suspicion turned into resolve. He began keeping records, screenshots, photos, emails, timestamps. He started digging through public records and HOA filings, tracing where the money was going. The more he found, the clearer it became that something was very wrong. Margaret wasn't just a power-hungry president. She was hiding something big. And if he could find it, maybe he could finally stop her from bullying the neighborhood. By the time the next HOA meeting was announced, a quarterly review open to all residents, Daniel had a plan. He'd been quiet long enough. He was done watching Margaret manipulate, intimidate, and lie to everyone. That night, as the sun set over Maplewood Estates, Daniel opened his laptop and began preparing the documents that would change everything. He didn't know exactly what Margaret was hiding yet, but he was close. And soon, everyone in the neighborhood would know too. The perfect little community of Maplewood Estates was about to be shaken to its core. The following morning, Maplewood Estates looked as pristine as ever. Sunlight filtered through the oak trees, casting dappled shadows on freshly mowed lawns. To any outsider, it was the picture of order, a place where every blade of grass stood at attention. But Daniel Reyes now saw it differently. Beneath that surface perfection, he knew corruption pulsed like a hidden current, spreading quietly through every street and mailbox. The HOA meeting was still 2 weeks away. That gave him time to collect evidence, to confirm what his instincts already whispered. Margaret Halliday was using her authority not to serve the neighborhood, but to serve herself. Daniel started with the HOA's financial reports. Most of them were accessible online, at least the ones from previous years. But the recent ones were missing, archived behind board member access. He remembered that Margaret was not only the president, but also served as acting treasurer after the previous one resigned due to family obligations. No one questioned it at the time. After all, Margaret always insisted she could handle the extra workload. That workload now looked suspiciously like an opportunity. Daniel began small. He checked the public records for Maplewood Estates HOA registration. The filings were made with the county's property management department. There, he found something odd, an expense line item for contractor services paid monthly to a business called Greenhaven Maintenance. He didn't recall ever seeing trucks or workers under that name in the neighborhood. Most of the community's upkeep was done by a company called Trimline Landscaping, a reputable firm with a visible presence. Curious, Daniel searched for Greenhaven Maintenance. There was no website, no business listing, just a post office box and a single name on file, Robert Halliday, Margaret's husband. That was the first thread in the unraveling fabric. It didn't take long for Daniel to notice the pattern. Over the past year, payments labeled as community projects or beautification efforts were all directed to Greenhaven Maintenance. Sometimes small, a few $100s for flowerbed refresh or irrigation updates. Other times larger, over $3,000 for landscaping renovation. But the most striking part? None of those renovations ever happened. The lawns hadn't changed in months. The irrigation system still leaked near the west gate. The flower beds were the same patch of dull marigolds they'd always been. It was all a front. Margaret was funneling HOA money through her husband's fake company, approving the invoices herself, cashing HOA checks into an account they both controlled. For the first time, Daniel felt both furious and exhilarated. She built her empire on threats and technicalities, hiding behind bylaws and community standards. But now he had something real, tangible proof that she wasn't the righteous leader she pretended to be. Still, he knew he needed to tread carefully. Margaret had allies, people she'd charmed or intimidated into silence. The vice president of the HOA, a meek retiree named Carol, rarely spoke up at meetings. The secretary, a young couple in their 20s, had recently been fined for hosting a non-approved gathering, their son's birthday party. Everyone lived under Margaret's quiet pressure. Daniel's plan was simple: gather undeniable proof and present it during the next meeting. when Margaret herself would be on stage, surrounded by the neighbors she'd deceived. He spent evenings at his dining table, building his case like a detective. Screenshots of transactions, archived notices, even photos of her improvement projects, or rather, the lack thereof. He noticed something else too. Every time Margaret imposed a fine, she demanded payment directly to her house for processing. The HOA website had an online payment system, but she discouraged its use, claiming it caused accounting confusion. That confusion, Daniel realized, was her cover. Meanwhile, the rest of Maplewood Estates carried on in blissful ignorance. Children played in cul-de-sacs. Neighbors waved as they trimmed hedges. The illusion of peace endured, as it always had. Only Daniel saw the cracks forming in the facade. Late one night, unable to sleep, he decided to take a walk. The moonlight spilled across the quiet streets, painting the rows of identical houses in pale silver. When he reached Margaret's property, he noticed the faint glow of her office window again. She was up late, just like before, typing rapidly, her face lit by the bluish glow of her laptop. He crept closer, careful not to make a sound. Through the blinds, he saw folders stacked high, some labeled confidential HOA records. He could make out a few words on a printed sheet: budget summary, petty cash reimbursement, and maintenance authorization. Then something caught his attention: a check, freshly signed, resting on the desk. It was addressed to Greenhaven Maintenance for $2,750. That was all the confirmation he needed. Daniel snapped a quick photo through the blinds before slipping back into the shadows. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from adrenaline. He finally had visual evidence linking Margaret directly to the false invoices. But he couldn't stop there. He needed the full paper trail, bank records, emails, anything that proved this wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping, but outright fraud. Over the next few days, he managed to contact a former board member, the one who had resigned. Through a cautious exchange of emails, Daniel learned that Margaret had forced the treasurer out after he questioned discrepancies in the budget. She told the board he was unfit to continue due to health issues. That treasurer, however, had quietly kept copies of old financial statements, ones that didn't match the current numbers, and he was willing to share them. When the documents arrived in Daniel's inbox, his suspicions were confirmed. Margaret had been siphoning funds for over a year, small amounts at first, then larger ones as no one noticed. Altogether, she'd taken nearly $20,000 from the HOA account under the guise of approved expenses. Her signature was on every check. The discovery filled Daniel with a grim satisfaction, but he also felt the weight of what he was about to do. Exposing her wouldn't just end her presidency, it would humiliate her publicly. And knowing Margaret, she wouldn't go down quietly. He began drafting a presentation, a simple timeline showing where the money went, who received it, and what was never delivered. He practiced explaining it without emotion, knowing that facts, not anger, would win the crowd. As the day of the HOA meeting approached, a tension settled over the neighborhood. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, reminding everyone of the upcoming quarterly review and community update. Margaret, ever the showman, promised exciting news about future projects. Daniel smiled bitterly when he read that line. The only exciting news would be hers, but not the kind she expected. On the evening before the meeting, Daniel reviewed his files one last time. He placed everything, printouts, photos, statements, into a neat folder. The evidence was irrefutable. Tomorrow, in front of the entire neighborhood, he would pull the curtain back on the woman who had ruled them with fake smiles and forged signatures. As he turned off the lights and headed to bed, the night was calm, still, and deceptively quiet, the kind of silence that always comes before a storm. Maplewood Estates was about to change forever. He laid down the final piece of evidence, the check for $2,750, made out to Greenhaven Maintenance, signed by Margaret, dated only a week ago. The same one he'd photographed through her office window. Gasps echoed through the hall. Margaret's face flushed red, her polished facade cracking under the weight of exposure. She tried to maintain control, insisting that the board had approved all expenditures. But when Daniel calmly pointed out that there was no official board approval, that she'd been signing and authorizing everything herself, the room turned against her. The vice president, Carol, hesitated before speaking for the first time in months. She admitted she'd never seen any of those invoices, nor had she been asked to approve them. The secretary couple exchanged anxious glances, then confirmed that Margaret had often asked them to sign documents for record-keeping, never explaining what they were. One by one, the neighbors began speaking, their voices no longer timid. They recalled her hypocrisy, her arbitrary fines, her dismissive treatment of complaints. The control Margaret had spent years cultivating began to crumble. Daniel stood quietly as the uproar grew. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply stepped back and let the truth speak for itself. For the first time, the neighborhood saw Margaret not as a leader, but as a fraud. Eventually, someone called for a motion to suspend her presidency pending investigation. Carol, her once loyal vice president, seconded it. The vote passed almost unanimously. Margaret sat frozen, her papers scattered across the table like fallen leaves. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, was gone. The meeting ended in chaos, some neighbors consoling one another, others furious, demanding refunds or audits. As Daniel walked out into the evening air, the sun dipped low behind the houses, casting long shadows across the perfect lawns. He could still hear the voices echoing behind him. Disbelief, anger, relief. The truth had finally broken free. But he also knew this wasn't over. Margaret Halliday wasn't the kind of woman to accept defeat quietly. As he reached his driveway, he noticed movement across the street. Margaret's house stood dark, her curtains drawn tight. But for a brief moment, he saw a silhouette in the window, still watching. The fight might have ended at the meeting, but the real fallout was only beginning. The morning after the meeting, Maplewood Estates was unrecognizable, not in its appearance, but in its atmosphere. The rows of identical homes, the neatly trimmed lawns, and the scent of freshly watered grass all looked the same, but something invisible had shifted. The quiet conformity that had ruled the neighborhood for years was gone. For the first time in a long time, people talked openly. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now gathered on sidewalks and driveways, whispering about what had happened at the community hall. Some were shocked, others furious, a few even giddy with relief. Margaret Halliday, the self-appointed queen of Maplewood, had finally fallen, and it had happened right in front of everyone. But the fall of a tyrant never ends cleanly. By mid-morning, word had spread through every cul-de-sac and mailbox. The HOA board was in disarray, unsure what came next. Carol, the timid vice president, had temporarily stepped in to handle administrative duties, though she looked pale and overwhelmed. There were rumors of an emergency audit, of legal complaints being drafted, of a possible police report if the missing funds couldn't be explained. Daniel watched all of it from a distance. He had no desire for attention. The night before, he'd barely slept. Even after exposing Margaret, there was no satisfaction, only a hollow sort of calm, like the quiet after a storm that you know isn't truly over. He made himself coffee and sat on his porch, listening to the neighborhood buzz. Every conversation seemed to carry his name. He'd gone from the quiet guy on Elm Court to the man who brought Margaret down. Some neighbors waved, offering nods of thanks. Others kept their distance, unsure whether to praise him or fear what he might uncover next. He didn't blame them. Margaret had ruled through intimidation for years. People weren't just angry, they were scared. They'd lived under her scrutiny for so long that freedom itself now felt unsettling. Around noon, Daniel received an email from Carol. It was brief, apologetic, and clearly written under stress. She thanked him for bringing the issue to light and explained that the HOA would be conducting a full internal review. She assured him that appropriate authorities may become involved depending on the audit's findings. It was a careful, bureaucratic way of saying, we're still figuring out how deep this goes. But what caught Daniel's attention wasn't the message itself. It was the CC list. Margaret's name was still there. Even after being suspended, she still had access to HOA correspondence. That was unsettling. By evening, the neighborhood's chatter began to quiet. Curtains were drawn early, and porch lights flickered on one by one. Maplewood Estates had never felt darker. Daniel tried to focus on work, but something gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the image of Margaret's face at the meeting. The way her expression shifted from confidence to panic in an instant. She had been caught off guard, yes, but she wasn't defeated. Not yet. He kept thinking about how she'd built her authority, how every rule and fine had been enforced with ruthless precision. That kind of control didn't vanish overnight. People like Margaret didn't just disappear quietly into humiliation. They schemed. They retaliated. And sure enough, the first sign came the next morning. When Daniel opened his front door to grab the newspaper, he found an envelope sitting on his doormat. No return address. Just his name, written in neat, familiar handwriting. He didn't have to open it to know who it was from. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead, no greeting. Just one typed line in bold font. You've made a serious mistake. There was no signature, but it carried the unmistakable chill of Margaret's voice. Formal, precise, venomous beneath the politeness. Daniel stared at the words for a long moment before setting the paper down. He wasn't surprised. He'd expected this. What he didn't know was what form her retaliation would take. Over the next few days, small things began to happen. Subtle, almost imperceptible at first. His mailbox was left open twice in a row. His garbage cans were tipped over one morning. Someone left a flyer on his windshield advertising lawn care for rule breakers. A cruel joke that only someone from the neighborhood would understand. It wasn't enough to call the police over, but it was enough to send a message. Margaret was still watching. Meanwhile, the HOA's temporary board held a series of tense emergency sessions. Daniel didn't attend them, though neighbors kept him updated. The findings were damning. Margaret had embezzled over $25,000 from HOA funds over an 18-month period. Some of the money had been traced directly to personal purchases, furniture, clothing, and even a new home security system installed at her own house. The evidence was overwhelming. A formal report was being prepared for law enforcement. And yet, Margaret refused to step down permanently. Through carefully worded emails, she claimed she was the victim of a targeted campaign of harassment and misinformation. She insisted the documents had been misrepresented and that procedural misunderstandings had caused confusion in the accounting. Some residents still wanted to believe her. After all, she had been the face of the neighborhood for years. She'd hosted events, sent birthday cards, arranged cleanups. People didn't want to believe their leader was a thief. But others were furious. They wanted accountability. They wanted justice. The neighborhood that had once prided itself on unity was fracturing down the middle. Through it all, Daniel stayed quiet. He didn't respond to Margaret's provocations, didn't engage in the gossip, didn't post on the community forum where arguments now raged daily. He just watched and waited. Then, late one night, as rain drizzled across the silent streets, Daniel noticed movement outside his window. He pulled the curtain back just enough to see a shadow near his driveway. Tall, slow-moving, deliberate. The figure stopped at his mailbox, lingered, then disappeared into the darkness. When Daniel stepped outside a few minutes later, the street was empty. But inside the mailbox was another envelope. This time, it wasn't a note. It was a photograph. A picture of him, standing outside the community hall on the night of the meeting, holding his folder. The angle suggested it had been taken from a distance, maybe even from Margaret's car. There was nothing written on the back, but the message was clear. She was watching him. The rain picked up, tapping against his jacket as he stared at the photo. The wind carried the faint hum of sprinklers and the smell of wet grass. The same familiar scent that once represented peace, now tainted by unease. He slipped the photo into his pocket and walked back inside, locking the door behind him. The evidence was still with the board, and the authorities would soon take over. But as far as Margaret was concerned, this wasn't about the HOA anymore. It was personal, and Daniel knew, somewhere in the shadows of Maplewood Estates, she was already planning her next move. For the next week, Maplewood Estates turned from a community into a battleground. not with shouting or broken windows, but with whispers, rumors, and quiet acts of sabotage. Margaret Halliday may have lost her title, but she hadn't lost her influence. She still knew which strings to pull, which neighbors to flatter, and which to frighten. For years, she had learned every weakness, every secret, every vulnerability hidden behind those white fences. And now, stripped of authority, she was using that knowledge as her weapon. It began with the rumors. At first, they were small. Murmurs passed between neighbors at the mailbox or during morning dog walks. "Did you hear Daniel fake those documents? I heard he had a grudge against Margaret. Someone said he used her personal information without permission." The stories spread like ivy through the neighborhood, twisting and changing as they grew. Margaret never appeared in public to say anything herself, but her closest allies, a handful of homeowners who had always benefited from her favoritism, began repeating the same lines, almost word for word. Daniel could feel the difference immediately. The same neighbors who had thanked him days ago now avoided eye contact. Conversation stopped when he walked by. Some people even crossed the street when they saw him coming. The online HOA forum, once filled with outrage toward Margaret, now buzzed with debates over whether Daniel had gone too far. Margaret was reclaiming her narrative, and she was doing it from the shadows. Then came the anonymous complaints. One morning, Daniel received an official-looking notice taped to his door. It accused him of violating community standards by keeping unauthorized construction materials on his property. He had no idea what that meant until he looked at the side of his house and saw a small pile of bricks that hadn't been there the night before. Someone had planted them there. A day later, another warning appeared: unauthorized exterior lighting. His porch bulb had been replaced. Someone had swapped it overnight for a brighter one that didn't match HOA regulations. It was all staged, coordinated. Margaret was trying to turn the very system he'd exposed back against him. Still, Daniel refused to react publicly. He documented everything: photos, timestamps, the letters, even the bricks. He sent them quietly to Carol, who was now overwhelmed, trying to hold the HOA together amid the chaos. She apologized in every message, insisting that steps were being taken, but Daniel could tell she was terrified. Margaret had gotten to her too. The neighborhood, once ruled by control, was now ruled by confusion. Without clear leadership, everything descended into disorder. Some homeowners stopped paying dues entirely, claiming the HOA had no legitimacy. Others demanded emergency elections. A few began posting homemade signs in their yards: "Transparency now, we deserve the truth, and stop the lies." The community that once prided itself on unity had fractured beyond repair. And in the middle of it stood Daniel, the man everyone blamed, admired, or feared depending on who you asked. One night, unable to sleep, he sat at his kitchen table reviewing the evidence again. He'd already turned most of it over to the HOA, but something about the financial records still bothered him. One line item from Margaret's earlier transactions didn't match the others. It wasn't a payment to Greenhaven Maintenance. It was a personal withdrawal labeled Legal Services Retainer. It had been made just 2 days before the HOA meeting. That detail chilled him. Margaret had known something was coming. She'd been preparing for a fight even before he exposed her. And now, maybe she was still fighting it, legally. The next morning, his suspicion was confirmed when a courier arrived at his door. The man handed him a thick envelope stamped with a local law firm's insignia. Inside was a cease and desist letter. Margaret was accusing him of defamation and invasion of privacy. The letter claimed he had stolen private documents, harassed a public figure, and caused irreparable damage to her reputation. She demanded he retract his false statements and issue a public apology within 7 days, or face a lawsuit. Daniel read the letter 3 times, each time feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. The sheer audacity of it almost made him laugh. She was the one who had stolen from the neighborhood, yet she was painting herself as the victim. Still, he couldn't dismiss it entirely. Even a baseless legal threat could cost him time, money, and peace of mind. And Margaret knew that. That night, he found another envelope in his mailbox, this one handwritten, sealed with tape. It wasn't from a lawyer. Inside was a short note. Don't fight her. She knows more than you think. There was no signature. Daniel's pulse quickened. He looked around the quiet street, scanning the darkened windows of nearby houses. The air felt heavier now, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But Daniel wasn't ready to back down. If anything, the threat only solidified his resolve. He knew the truth, and he wasn't going to let her rewrite it. Over the next few days, he started digging again, not just into Margaret's finances, but into her personal life. He searched property records, scanned local archives, and cross-referenced every business and address tied to her or her husband. And then, one evening, buried in a list of county liens and property transfers, he found something unexpected. Margaret and Robert Halliday had another property, a small house listed under a shell company in a neighboring town. It wasn't unusual for people to own second homes, but this one had a recent utility connection and large payments made just weeks apart. When Daniel traced the payments, his jaw tightened. They matched the exact amounts withdrawn from the HOA account. The stolen money hadn't just been pocketed. It had been used to secretly purchase another property. He double-checked the address and found it was registered as vacant land restoration. But according to satellite images, there was already a fully built home there, one with a new roof and renovated landscaping. The same landscaping company name appeared on the invoice, Greenhaven Maintenance. It was all connected. Every lie, every theft, every manipulation. Margaret hadn't just been stealing for greed. She'd been building something, preparing an escape plan. Daniel printed everything, every transaction, every document, and stored them in a secure folder. This was it, the missing piece, the one thing that would destroy her credibility beyond repair. But as he placed the papers on his desk, a sudden noise made him freeze. A car door slammed outside, then another. He walked to the window and peered through the blinds. Parked across the street was Margaret's car. Unmistakable, black, perfectly polished. She was standing beside it, staring directly at his house. No words, no gestures, just watching. The porch light reflected off her eyes, cold and unreadable. After a long moment, she turned, got back in the car, and drove off into the night. Daniel stood there long after she was gone, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. The evidence he held could end everything for her. The theft, the lies, the manipulation. But now, he realized something darker. Margaret wasn't just fighting to save her reputation. She was fighting to protect something else, something she couldn't afford to let anyone discover. And Daniel had just stumbled right into it. The following morning dawned gray and windless, the kind of stillness that seems to hold its breath before a storm. Maplewood Estates, once the definition of calm, suburban perfection, now felt like a place under siege, not from noise or crime, but from truth. The gossip had reached a fever pitch. Some residents believed Margaret had fled town. Others whispered that she was planning to sue the entire HOA. But the truth was more complicated and far more sinister. Daniel Reyes hadn't slept. The image of her car, idling outside his house the previous night, replayed in his mind on a loop. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the composed smile she always wore when she wanted people to underestimate her. He knew she wasn't done yet, but this time neither was he. The evidence he had uncovered, the property records, the false company, the payments that matched every stolen HOA dollar, had revealed more than just theft. They revealed intent. Margaret hadn't simply been stealing for greed. She'd been building a new life, in secret, just one town over, while using her position to fund it. But there was something else in the documents that had caught Daniel's attention, something that didn't quite fit. One of the listed owners on the second property wasn't Margaret or her husband Robert. It was a woman named Elaine Brooks, a name Daniel didn't recognize. He spent the morning tracing it through public records. Elaine Brooks was 42, unmarried, and had recently applied for a small business license for a design firm. The mailing address? The same P.O. box used by Greenhaven Maintenance. The pattern clicked instantly. Elaine wasn't a random name. She was a partner, or more accurately, an alias. When Daniel dug deeper, he discovered that Elaine Brooks didn't exist before 5 years ago. There was no prior address, no tax records, Nothing. She was a fabricated identity, one used to move money without scrutiny. But as he compared photos from the business license application with social media posts, his breath caught. The woman in the ID photo looked strikingly familiar. Same face shape, same sharp eyes, same perfectly styled hair. Elaine Brooks was Margaret Halliday, under a different name. Daniel sat back in his chair, stunned. Margaret hadn't just stolen money. She had built a second identity, a life completely detached from Maplewood Estates, ready to walk away at any moment if her crimes ever caught up to her. She had been preparing her escape, one fraudulent invoice at a time. But now the walls were closing in. He printed the final documents, attaching everything together into one comprehensive report. He'd already reached out to the local authorities, who had expressed interest after the HOA audit results were sent to them. Now, with this new discovery, he had the missing link, proof of premeditated fraud and identity falsification. It was enough to end her story for good. That afternoon, the HOA board held one last emergency meeting. The air inside the community hall was thick with tension. For once, Margaret wasn't at the front of the room. She was seated in the back, arms crossed, face expressionless. Her presence drew a visible unease from the residents. Some refused to even look at her. Others whispered to one another, wondering why she had dared to show up at all. Carol, pale but resolute, stood at the podium. Her voice trembled slightly as she began. "We have completed the full review of Maplewood Estates' financial records. The findings have been submitted to the county authorities, who will conduct a formal investigation." She paused, glancing at Margaret. "Mr. Reyes has provided additional evidence that clarifies the extent of the violations." Daniel rose from his seat, carrying a folder much like he had during that first confrontation, though this one felt heavier, not in weight, but in consequence. He stepped to the front, his expression calm, his voice steady. He didn't accuse, didn't raise his tone. He simply presented the facts. He showed how every withdrawal from the HOA account had been routed through Greenhaven Maintenance, a shell company tied to Margaret's husband. He showed the matching property records, linking those payments to the purchase of a hidden home in the neighboring town. And then, finally, he revealed the alias, Elaine Brooks, and the photographic proof that tied that false identity directly to Margaret. The room erupted in disbelief. Gasps, murmurs, and the occasional shouted curse filled the air. Even those who had once defended her now looked horrified. Margaret sat motionless, her lips pressed together, her knuckles white against her folded arms. Daniel continued, explaining how the scheme had been designed to allow her to leave Maplewood Estates behind entirely, to sell her home, vanish under her alias, and start fresh using money stolen from her own neighbors. When he finished, he simply said, "That's the truth the records tell, and the rest will be for the law to decide." The silence that followed was crushing. Carol looked around the room, visibly shaken. "Effective immediately," she said, her voice barely audible. "Margaret Halliday is permanently removed from the HOA board. The board will also cooperate fully with law enforcement in the investigation of her financial conduct." There was no vote this time, no debate. The decision was absolute. Margaret slowly stood. Every eye followed her. Her face remained composed, but her eyes, once so sharp and confident, were filled with something Daniel had never seen in her before. Fear. She gathered her papers, but her hands trembled. And then, for the first time in her reign, she left the room in silence. No speech, no denial, no control. The door closed behind her with a quiet finality that felt louder than any argument. The following week, Maplewood Estates began to breathe again. Neighbors started helping each other repaint fences, mow lawns, and plant flowers, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. The atmosphere slowly shifted from fear to relief. For the first time in years, people smiled without watching over their shoulders. Daniel became something of a local legend. Not a hero in the grand sense, but a symbol, proof that even one person, armed with persistence and integrity, could stand up to corruption. Still, he stayed humble. He attended meetings, volunteered for small projects, and quietly worked with Carol to help restructure the HOA. His only condition was simple: transparency. Every report, every expenditure, every rule would be public. No more hidden folders. No more secrets. As for Margaret, she vanished within days. Her house went dark, blinds closed, mailbox empty. A few weeks later, a for sale sign appeared in her yard, and the moving truck followed soon after. No one saw her again. Rumors spread that she had been questioned by the police, that charges were pending, that she'd been forced to surrender her second property. But Daniel didn't care about the outcome anymore. He'd done what needed to be done. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the rows of maple trees, he stood on his porch, the same place where the whole ordeal had started months ago, with nothing more than a fine and a row of rose bushes. The flowers still bloomed there, untouched and unbothered. The air felt lighter now. The neighborhood, once held hostage by fear and control, was finally free. And somewhere out there, Margaret Halliday, the woman who built her world on lies and intimidation, was facing the one thing she could never control: consequences.